Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Doty, and I'm the host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast, where we explore the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. Welcome to the Into the Magic Shop podcast. My guest today is Jana Borg, PhD, an assistant research professor at Duke University's Social Science Research Institute, where she studies neuroscience, computational modeling, and various emerging technologies to understand how individuals make social decisions that impact and influence others or that are influenced by others. Her areas of expertise include empathy and moral judgment. She has a new book that just was released called Moral AI and How We Get There. Her co-authors include Walter Sinnott Armstrong, as well as Vincent Konitzer. I hope you enjoy our conversation today. Thank you. Well, Jana, it's great to see you. It's been some time since we were together at Stanford. How long ago was that?
I was trying to think about that myself. So I graduated in 2012, but I think we maybe met 2007 or 2008 or something like that. When were you starting CCARE?
Let's see, 2008.
2008. So yeah, I think that's when we met.
Really? Wow. Then that's a long time.
I know. It's been quite a while.
Well, I as I recall, and I could be off a little bit, but you were working with rodents then, and we were discussing, if you will, compassion, and actually you had shared some interesting findings that in fact show that there is empathy and compassion among rodents, which I think there's a tendency to denigrate the morals of what often humans refer to as lesser entities, but in fact they're quite strong.
Yeah, and at least some of them. I lost a good chunk of my life trying to find something like empathy in mice. And they, despite the fact that there are many science and nature papers out there claiming, and maybe there's some rudimentary aspects, but let's just say they're little psychopaths compared to rats, at least in my hands. Yeah.
Well, I would suggest mice in my house are psychopaths.
So. In mine as well, although very crafty.
Oh, God, that could be a whole topic for conversation. It's interesting. What?
We may go there. I mean, my life these days is the intersection of intelligence and things like empathy, I feel like. So maybe we'll go there.
Yes. No, I'm. It's funny. I have a 14-year-old, and he found some mouse poop in his room, so now he's completely paranoid. So. But again, a topic for another day. So you're at Duke now, and you've moved away, I think you were saying, from rodent studies per se to data analytics, which relates to one of the topics we're going to talk about, which is moral AI. And you have a new book, Moral AI and How Do We Get There? And you have a couple co-authors who, are they more in the data analytics side of the house, or?
They are. So one of the co-authors is Vincent Konitzer, and he's a computer scientist. So he's a AI expert, specifically in particular on cooperative AI. And Walter Sinnott Armstrong is my other co-author, and he's a philosopher and practical ethicist. So we've had a long-standing collaboration since I started my professorship here. So I guess since 2016. So wow. It's been a long time coming. Yeah.
Well, that brings up an interesting topic because, of course, there is this intersection between, I suppose, AI, morals, ethics, and philosophy, and neuroscience, and what does each mean? I'm sure you followed the debate about consciousness as well. And I think it was Christoph Koch, he had said something that we would solve the hard problem of consciousness but in neuroscience, and I guess he lost his bet to, was it Dave Chalmers, and he owed him a case of wine.
I think that's right, yep. And I think actually Walter, if I'm not mistaken, I might be mistaken. I think he just got a grant actually to bring a whole bunch of people together here to Duke to talk about AI consciousness. But I think if I remember correctly, I was listening to one of your other podcasts or one of your other invitees, and you were talking about, I think you said something like, I just don't know what to make of this consciousness stuff. Like what? And I really resonated with that. I mean, I've gone through different phases in my career, and it's like when I have different levels of energy, perhaps, I've gone through times where like, I'm going to get it. I understand it. We're going to solve this. And other times I'm like, I give up. I don't know. And yeah, it's a hard.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, and this may making a statement about my own lack of intelligence, but it's like every few months there's an incredibly brilliant person who has a new theory about consciousness, and it's like, well, why don't we all just make up theories, because it seems like none of them are provable. It's sort of intellectual masturbating. But I'm sure somebody listening to this is now going to send me a note and go, you obviously know nothing since you haven't really followed this and clearly don't understand the basic precepts of consciousness, blah, 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 blah.
And then you can invite them on the podcast and have another great conversation. So
yes, well, yeah, hopefully I won't piss them off too much. But no, it's always an interesting conversation. I just feel like no one has given a satisfactory explanation. None of the science has demonstrated that any of it's provable. So where does that leave us again?
I mean, so, I started this by saying, I'm with you now. I've gone through these different waves, and I'm in a wave where I'm like, I give up. And I think that, I can imagine maybe there will be ways that we can at least have something that gets close to proof, or that we can at least test or disprove some of these theories. And AI is definitely, there are things happening with AI that none of us thought were possible 2 years ago, even a year ago. And so I'm much more humble now about these things than I was before. So I haven't totally given up hope, but I'm definitely in part of a phase where I'm not touching this. This can be for someone else.
No, I think you're right. But it's interesting how you're the phase we are in AI, because we are seeing incredible leaps in what it can do. Which brings us actually back to our topic.
Yeah.
So explain to me moral AI or moral ethics, if you will. What does that mean, and how does this connect, if you will, to cultural relativism versus universalism, and how will a moral AI adjust to that?
Oh man, okay, so many things to okay, let's start with the big picture. The big picture is, what's the goal of moral AI? The goal of moral AI is to have AI that behaves in ethically acceptable enough ways, at least. And there are technical things you have to think about there. There's societal things you have to think about there. There are philosophical things you have to think about there. There are practical things and policy things. So all of that comes to play. We work on technical solutions, but you can't do that in isolation. And so in the book, a lot of it's not just technical solutions. We talk about a lot of other things too. Now, you are asking kind of the first thing everyone always asks, which is, well, how can you even think about doing something like that when everyone has different morals? And I would first respond with, this is one of the things that I think is actually really good. I mean, sometimes I get disheartened working on this space, and other times I get really encouraged. And one of the things that really encourages me is that it forces you, by having AIs or trying to think about what you want your AIs to do, it forces us to be very clear about what we want in general. And kind of everyday life without AI, we kind of muddle through stuff. Like, yeah, there's some ethicists, maybe there's some ethical guidelines, but it's not, we don't necessarily force ourselves to really articulate what we think is right and wrong and how to resolve those things. We just kind of muddle through it. And if we're going to scale these things into a system, we can't just muddle through it anymore. We have to, mathematically define it, and that means we have to agree. And so this is my kind of way of saying it's a hard problem. We can dig into how you might address it. But it's not just an AI problem. It's really a societal problem, period. And now AI is forcing us to deal with it.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting point because as we have repeatedly seen and has been demonstrated to us, humans are muddlers and not logical, thoughtful, and to be frank with you, moral or ethical in any way, shape, or form. In fact, Paul Gilbert, who you probably know, developed compassion-focused therapy. He was commenting that humans are the most despicable, horrible living beings in the world because they hurt each other repeatedly for nonsense. And so as we were talking about earlier with mice, they're as bad as any mice you've seen.
I often say that my rats are doing things that many humans wouldn't do, or at least in those experiments. But and I agree with you. I think we all have our reasons for getting into research, and for me, that reason is I have just a very visceral reaction to harm and others, and it's like this is kind of like my own therapy. My whole research career is my own therapy. How do I make sense of the harm we cause? But also, I do want to. It's important for us all to remember we also do these incredibly altruistic things sometimes, and really put ourselves in front, or put others in front of ourselves sometimes in ways, especially mice in particular, do not. And so it's important to keep that in mind too. But yeah, it makes it a very hard problem, especially and if you're trying to teach an AI what to do, we're very imperfect teachers. So how do you navigate that? These are all really important questions.
Well, and that brings up the reality of bias in our society, which then gets translated into bias within AI. And do you have to create a independent knowledge base in which you remove the biases to actually create a moral AI? Is that the solution?
That's one of the ones, that's one of the things we're exploring. I think that's one of the things that inspires me, is that it's one of the opportunities AI does give, if we can bring it to fruition, is that if we can measure our bias, especially if we have enough data, then it may be that we have ways that we can correct for it, or an AI can correct for it. And in fact, one of the things that again inspires me is not just building that into a system, but giving us feedback to help us identify our own bias, and maybe even help us correct for it and learn when we're biased and improve on that. So I think all of that is an opportunity. It's not easy, though, of course, and it's hard since we have no idea what's going on and how many of these AI systems work at all. It's hard to predict when they're going to come out, and how are you sure your model is right, and how are you sure you're not just going to be injecting more junk back in when you're trying to correct? It's all hard stuff. But I think this is one of the cases I feel a little more optimistic about. I'm not saying things are there yet by any means, and I might be eat my words, in the air. But I feel a little bit more optimistic that AI, we might be able to at least manage the bias in AI eventually, and in fact, even use AI to help us identify our bias more moving forward. Again, I might eat my words, but I think bias isn't the only problem. Of course, it's not the only junk that we spit into this. We're often, we make some very bad decisions and do some very mean things to each other. And if AIs are trained on that, how do we make sure the AIs don't do those things?
Well, and I think that gets back to the notion of the fear expressed by a variety of individuals. Do you feel that there would have to be sort of cultural thoughtfulness imparted into the AI itself?
The first question is whether we need the AI model itself to have some type of sensitivity built into it. And here's an area where I would have given you a totally different answer 2 years ago. And I've really become humble to say I'm not sure anymore. 2 years ago, I would have said, yes, of course. Because in many ways, that's what humans do. And that's kind of what my default was. You're going to need to have a model that has all this built in from the ground up. The way that these large language models are like ChatGPT or Claude from Anthropic, or kind of these tools that that's what people think of when they think of AI these days, even though it's not the only kind of AI by any means. But the way that those are evolving has made me question that. So some of those kind of original models, when they were first trained, they were horribly biased and spit out all kinds of junk, right? But recently they've shown, at least in some research settings, but also some research settings that, are kind of testing with us, whether we know it or not, that you can use kind of other models to kind of fine tune those original terrible models, psychopathic models. I'm generalizing. I don't know if they're psychopathic.
Sure.
And it kind of works. At the very least, it seems to make them better. Now, that doesn't mean the result is something we should be happy with. But the fact that they seem to be making some progress by kind of basically making a model that can talk and understand language, and then after the fact, kind of fine tune it to make it more ethical is surprising to me. I'm still surprised that it works, especially the way it seems to be working. And, so maybe we'll keep advancing this front, and maybe it is the case that when you're building a completely artificial system, not a biological system, because it's a completely different story, I think, when you're talking about a biological system. But when you're building an artificial system, maybe you don't have to have it from the ground up. But then that also offers up some of the other things you were talking about, which is how do you make it culturally sensitive? Well, but if that's true, you could potentially fine tune for different cultures and different community groups if the group can agree on what they want in the first place, which is another thing we can talk about because that's its own challenge.
Well, to respond to that, one is it would seem almost as if the AI itself would create a program within itself based on bias or understanding bias that would then search out and remove the biases. That would seem like
or you could do that at least. Yeah.
Of course, as you pointed out earlier, the problem is we have no clue what's really going on in there. It's not like we can lift the lid up and go, oh, okay, I see where it's going here. So you're sort of stuck with whatever you programmed there, never knowing how it's going to react, I suppose. The other aspect, which I'm finding in my own work, and I think, and I don't think you ever signed up, or we ever figured out how to get you signed up. I don't know why, because your email would never show.
I was actually going to use our conversation today to push you to help me figure out how I can get signed.
Okay, I actually asked my CTO to reach out to you, but maybe he didn't do that. So we'll do that. But anyway, what we're alluding to is I've been working on a project where we created a conversational AI knowledge base that's imbued with compassion-focused therapy and psychology, with the goal, by having it separated from general AI, that it would not hallucinate or sort of go off track. That being said, I think we've done that, but the challenge is that at least for us, and maybe for a lot of other people in this, is again the programming of it, where it actually communicates with you with the goal of helping you deal with your mental health issues, stress, anxiety, and depression, and but you without with the problem being that, what is the ideal time length for a conversation? How do you use the knowledge that they've gained from the individual to guide them along? And within the context of a conversation, what's the best way to direct them? And as you know from your work yourself, creating a moral AI, in some ways this relates to that, is really, really hard.
Yes. Yeah, I actually was going to ask you, I was hoping that I could do a little, we could chat before we had this conversation. And so now I'm just guessing. But one of the things I really wanted to ask you, and maybe I'll use this to kind of, get your opinions about something else too. So one of the things we didn't talk about in the book that I'm really concerned about is what the impact of AI is going to be on social connection. And I know this is something you talk about a lot and have studied a lot, and you probably know the facts. You remember the facts even better than I do. But when we feel socially connected, by we I mean humans, when we feel socially connected, we are so much more resilient to all kinds of stressors. Our mental health is better. We recover from surgery better. We follow our medication prescriptions better. The list is endless, and the effects are dramatic. These are not little effects. These are dramatic effects. And so I don't think people are thinking enough about what AI's role is going to be in this critical function. And on the one hand, it can help our social connection. This is where, of course, this is where I'm alluding to your app. And for some people, it might give them an opportunity to feel connected where they can't with humans, A, or humans that don't know what they're doing, B. But for others, it might make them feel like, well, am I only able to connect with an AI and I can't connect with the human? Does that make me feel worse? Or if the AI says the wrong things, and so I'm curious how you have thought about that as you've developed your app and your vision and everything.
So you've turned the tables on me. Now I'm the interviewee. Plus, you asked me the same goddamn multi-compound question.
I learned from the best. Jim.
Well, those are very interesting points. I mean, I think, as you were just alluding to, there's immense amount of data regarding the need for social connection and how how that actually makes us our best selves, and whether that's in terms of mental or physical function. Those are absolutely critical, and ultimately it affects longevity. Because if you're stressed and anxious, as you well know from your rodent work and probably from interaction with some of your colleagues.
Absolutely.
That is critically important. So then the question is, and this is one of the things I've been looking at for a while. If you look at the mental health space, you have sort of apps like Calm and Headspace, which are promoted, but it's interesting because they've been around for several years now, and neither have gone public. And which is interesting because the attrition rate, or the what's the word? Maybe that's the best word. I can't remember what the actual word is, but there's minimal stickiness to this, right? It can't hold somebody's attention. So then you look at what people would tout as sort of those suffering from mental health disorders. What's the next best thing? And some people would talk about something like Wobot, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but you type in on your computer into outer space and it goes somewhere, and then you get an AI response to that. And there's data that people do respond to that. In fact, that's how they sell it. And then, of course, you have therapy. Now, some people would argue, the reason nobody ever quits therapy because they'd never get better. Because if they did, then no therapist would be employed anymore. But I shouldn't be cynical like that. Obviously, it helps many, many people. The problem with that, of course, is that, after 5 p.m., they're hard to find. And that's, for most people, the issues with connection, with anxiety occur when they're not distracted, which is in the evening. But getting back to what we're trying to do, which has two components, one of which, of course, is deeply embedded, is the AI component. But I think the other addresses the social connection aspect of it. And I'm sure you've tried virtual reality where, you put the goggles on and typically they put you over an abyss and you're on a plank, and then they tell you to jump off and nobody will jump off, generally speaking. And but it's interesting here on a cognitive level, you're safe, but on some weird, very powerful, unconscious level, you cannot not respond to what appears to be real to your subconscious. And so in the context of connecting to AI, with the Wobots or those types of apps where you just type in, I don't think you can get an emotional connection to that on any deep level because there's nothing there that's coming. You can't relate to that. And I think one of the advantages is by using an avatar, even though it's not real, it says it's not real, you still respond to it like a human being, and you cannot not respond to it that way. So the great thing is that you can get very emotionally connected to it, which is the advantage of it, because, again, all of us want to have that trusted friend who is non-judgmental, accepting, available 24/7, compassionate, empathic. And, and that really we feel that and want that and get attached to that. But I would argue that while all of that is wonderful, the goal here is to make you feel comfortable so that then you can feel comfortable interacting with humans again. It's not to trap you into a relationship. Now, I would suggest, as you probably know, there are people in the venture capital community who will go to the most base level to get you addicted, right? And that, unfortunately, will take susceptible individuals down the path of what they would call a special friend or an intimate relationship, which then very much disconnects you from reality. As you know, fantasy is a million times more powerful than reality. And I think for a susceptible group of people, it can be very, very damaging. Now, what we've tried to do is, no matter how many ways you try to have a relationship with the avatar, at least in the case of what we're doing at Happy AI, is it just won't happen, at least so far in everything we've tested. In fact, my son asked the avatar recently to go out on a date, and she said, well, I'm happy to go on an e-date with you or watch a movie with you, but as long as this relates to helping you with your stress and anxiety. So
Interesting.
But it's hard to do because this is the problem with humans, as we were just talking about. There are a lot of vulnerable people. There are a lot of people who lack self-awareness or don't understand the drivers of their behavior or the fact that they're biased, and then they can be manipulated by these systems. And then the question is, and this is how is actually, I think, an important question. While you're researching this, who's listening? And I don't mean that in a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
But as an example, we have, a fellow who's manufacturing drones, right? And they're using AI to kill people. What's that about, and how do you? Is that right, or is it right because it's your country of choice? And how? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest dangers, of course, with all AI development. It's one of the main things we talk about in the book. It's one of the biggest safety concerns. Is who's going to get hold of these things, and how easy will it be, and what will they do with it when they get a hold of it? And I think, in the case of drones, and military applications are some of the ones we should be most concerned about, because a not very intelligent AI that's on a nuclear warhead still will cause tremendous amount of damage. You don't need a superhuman AI to cause a lot of damage in the military, right? So drones are one category, but I think it's easier. And as you clearly are not one of these, but I think many people think that it's only the military or, say, self-driving cars where this matters. But in many ways, it could matter even more on something like, psychological health. And I think psychological health, and I should say from the beginning, I mean, part of the reason I ask that is because I'm with you. These are some of the applications I think are most important, and that I'm working on too. I mean, a lot of my newer research is on what kind of empathic or compassionate AI would we want? What would that look like? And what kinds do we definitely not want? And how does that relate to morality down the line too? But I think it's really important to think through, okay, let's say that you've succeeded, Jim, and you have this avatar that really helps people and that people trust. Well, now what if a bad actor is able to, without you knowing, get into your system and use that to manipulate your users, right? And manipulate them to do terrible things or to do terrible things to themselves. And I don't think that that's unlikely. I think there are a lot of countries out there that are particularly interested in psychological warfare and psychological methods, and these are things that I think they're on the horizon, so we have to think about how to handle them. Does that mean we shouldn't be working on it? No. It just means this research it's much more ethically laden than, than it would be easy, than we want it to be. We'll put it that way. And well, I'm curious what you have to say about that. And then
well, no, I think you're absolutely correct. And I want to preface this by saying we have a tendency to moralize in the United States that there's some exception to us. And in fact, if you look at the history of our actions towards other countries who we decide are against us, we have used all sorts of horrible, completely unethical methods to attain our goals. And so in no way do I want to imply that we have clean hands on any of this, nor are we the arbitrators of morals or ethics. That being said, in a larger picture, I think any reasonable human being should be focused on that and what that means. And so, how do we control these other governments who, seek world domination, including ourselves? And I don't have an answer to that. I think a more disturbing question I would also bring up is, as we see ever increasing income inequality, we have a class of people who frankly live above the rules. And many of these are in the billionaire class. And while, I think they're probably less than 5,000, they control a significant amount of the world's wealth. And unlike, let's say, you or I, if we tried to call the president of China, we would get hung up on. Well, if you're a multi-billionaire worth tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, you have direct access to all of these people and to knowledge that none of us, or certainly the average person, doesn't have. And they manipulate this to increase income inequality. Well, beyond climate change and AI, I think this is also one of the most horrible realities that we're dealing with.
Absolutely. And you make a really good point. I'm glad you put a flag in the ground to make it clear the U.S. is not above anybody. And in fact, one of the things I think we should be most concerned about is how the political groups within the U.S. would use this technology. Or can you imagine it? I mean, it doesn't seem unlikely that you would have a group that says, these are conservative AI therapists. These are liberal AI therapists. And then you buy access to one or the other, and now you have an echo chamber on steroids. And perhaps that also, a type of manipulation that can be very, very personalized and very personal, that it's hard to track. So I think all of those things, I don't think that that's far off, actually. I think it just takes someone with enough creativity and money behind them to be like, this is the way the political, season is going to go this time.
No, you're right. In fact, actually, it's interesting. There was a case in, well, I probably shouldn't say the country because, at least in theory, this is confidential information that was shared with me. But there was a Western country, and there was a billionaire who wanted a particular political candidate because he had significant influence. And he spent $100 million to manipulate the election to get the guy ultimately elected, with the goal that it would ultimately save him hundreds of millions of dollars. And he hired a team of neuroscientists and psychologists, and they placed all these micro ads in different social media, and it swayed the election. And this is, again, I think, another point, because if you look at historically, and marketing, if you will, which is manipulation of people, in the 16th and 17th century, it was minimal and it was crude and it may or may not have worked. But, now we're in an era where all of these major companies hire psychologists and neuroscientists to create dopamine drips, if you will, that addict people and motivate them. And fundamentally, many of these are owned by the billionaire class. And so how do you overcome that? Because fundamentally, they're acting like government in a way, and they're propagandizing. And you brought up the political landscape. It's interesting if you look at one particular party. Now, I'm not saying both of them don't have huge issues because they're not really addressing the needs of the people. But, if you look at the right-leaning parties, you have one group is the disenfranchised people from both parties previously who are very unhappy and in pain. Then you have an more educated group who are thinking in terms of how can I take advantage of the situation. Then you have a third group, which is the wealthy class, which is how do I control the politicians? And this is both right and left, because now there's essentially unlimited capital coming in because of the, what's it called? Something United, the Supreme Court case that allowed all these donations and without listing who it is. And you have actually corporate interests and the billionaire class actually writing the legislation that they then give to the politician.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. And we are definitely getting into the realm of things where other people have more confidence about what to do than I do. We have written a little bit about this in our book, but like I said, I'm very humble about this because these are really hard problems. But I think part of what we have to do, and again, maybe I'll eat my words, but I think we're at a bit of an inflection point where people are close to wanting to give up on institutions and close to wanting to give up on their sense of agency or ability to impact anything. And there are good reasons for that. There's a lot going on, and there's kind of stuff is constantly bombarding us and making us feel that we have no control. But there is still time for us to have some control. So I think it's really important. That's part of why we wrote the book, actually. I should clarify for the audience, it's supposed to be for a popular audience or for a general audience. You're not supposed to have any background going into it. And part of the reason why was to empower general community members to feel like they know what's going on and can figure out what they want to say about it and then do something about it. And I think, there are things that we can do in tandem. None of them are going to work in isolation. And I should also say, I'll talk about this in the context of AI, but this doesn't solve all societal problems. And of course, the way society is structured and the power imbalances are, that's intricately connected to all of this. So I don't want to pretend this would solve it, but I think that part of the things we should be asking for are types of regulations that require community input and require documentation of that input and how that's being handled and representational input. And that might take some innovation about how to figure out how to do it. But imagine if there was a gig economy where you're giving feedback on, AI products and what they're doing and kind of the impact they're having on you, and that it's your responsibility when you make an AI product to collect that data, report it, and then show how what you're doing about it. That's one of the types of things that we propose and that we think needs to happen. Again, it's not obvious exactly what those mechanisms would look like, but for an innovative society, I'm sure we can figure it out.
Well, I think you could, though, argue why isn't that done with the marketing class, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what you're talking about here fundamentally.
I agree, and I think it's a good question. I think, part of the stock answer, if I was just going to try to give an easy answer, that you should push back on is that, what AI does is it takes everything and puts it on steroids, right? It makes it more effective, more reachable, cheaper, and all of those things. And so it's not that we shouldn't care about about marketing in general. It's that AI, we have to make sure we take care of AI, and perhaps even in doing that, it'll help us figure out how to handle things like general marketing. I mean, when we talk about elections, for example, it's not like people haven't been lying in elections in the U.S. or other countries, for a long time. It's not even always illegal to do so. And, you can buy or pay an artist to make an ad or make a picture of a candidate that's surrounded by community members they've never interacted with. It just costs more.
Well, I think you're referring to the photograph of Donald Trump surrounded by Afro-Americans. I think that was AI generated, not an
It was AI generated, and you can generate that in a minute now, and anyone.
Oh yeah, no. Well, and this is what's scary, and I feel again, I would say reading your book and talking to you and thinking about this. I mean, I oftentimes feel overwhelmed, and what is it that I can do? And it's not in any way giving away my agency. I just sit there and go, fuck, I could barely handle it before. And now it's seemingly getting worse. And then the question is, who's really pulling the strings? I mean, you have foreign governments who have agendas. You have extraordinarily wealthy people who have agendas. And how are any of us to know? And again, I don't want to imply I'm an average person, and I don't mean that in an egotistical way, but in theory, I'm reasonably well educated and knowledgeable, and I feel I don't know shit about how to do any of this stuff.
Yeah. I agree with you. And in some ways, that's the most dangerous aspect of what's going on across the world these days, is that those who are in power want us to feel that way and are, leveraging that. Not everyone in power. I didn't mean to suggest that, but
I think everyone in power.
You think that? So one thing I will say, actually, I feel like I go through different circles and cycles throughout both my life and my career, and this is one place where I'm starting to come full circle and come back to, what got me into this is, how do I make the right moral judgments myself, to people, and how do I, when I see someone that needs help, how do I make sure I actually help them? And if I'm hurting someone, we've all, and it's embarrassing to admit, I'm stuttering because I don't want to admit it, but of course I've done terrible things to people, especially when I was a teenager, and I just feel terrible about it now. So what do I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen again? And in many ways, I'm coming back to that now, Jim. It's like it's easy to be completely overwhelmed. And as human decision makers, when we get overwhelmed, we have a couple of different strategies. Sometimes it's just to give up and just say, I'll just go with the, wherever the tide takes me. Sometimes you just latch onto some heuristic that's super simple and you just hold on to it for dear life because at least you have a heuristic. And then other times is you figure out what is it you really think and how do you navigate these situations. And I think that's where I'm starting to come. If you talked to me, 8 months ago, I was much more pessimistic. And maybe it's because some of the research we're doing is I'm learning so much from it personally about my own moral judgment that I'm realizing that there's power here. But I think that it's really important to remember we have so much power within our own brains, within our own selves to figure out what's right. And if we can, galvanize those skills again, then we can figure this out together. And the most powerful way to overcome all of this is to all make good judgments, ethical judgments, and to care about each other. It's just not easy, of course.
No, that's right. Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up, which I'll use as a plug for my new book.
Good.
So I have this book coming out called Mind Magic, The Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. And this isn't to promote the woo-woo or the pseudoscience, but it's to utilize our knowledge of neuroscience and things that we've learned to, in some ways, as you mentioned, we have incredible power within ourselves, and so many of us give our agency away to others who sit in judgment. And it's really sad. And if people understood the power they have, and actually the power they have to change their brains or to have very, very powerful influence over their lives versus believing that, the first sentence of the book says, the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. And
where did you grow up again? Can you remind me? I grew up in Jersey, so that makes me feel at home when you say the word fuck. But where did you grow up?
In Southern California, and so yes, but probably for us. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. I was going to make a class distinction, but I realize, having been around many people in a variety of different class levels, everyone says fuck. Of course, depending on that class level, you may deny it, but it's true. But the point I was making, though, is that, so many people think that the world is in judgment and it limits their ability to have agency, and it's just, not true at all. I think the other aspect, which we've also alluded to, is a belief that others are don't see the world the same way. And what I mean by that is that all of us have prejudices, which you were alluding to, but most of us don't see them. And how do you understand your own biases and prejudices, which liberate you from many of the negative characteristics that so many of us carry? Now, part of that bias and prejudice is a manifestation of our backgrounds and the baggage that we carry from that. So, and I'm sure you've thought about this. What are the actions you do? Obviously, you are very sensitive. You're very deep in this, as you've expressed a few times. You have this deep moral concern about the right thing. How do you deal with that in the face of sort of a world that sometimes appears hostile or not caring?
Oh, that's such a good question. I have many things I want to say. I'm going to forget some of them. But let's start with, I think the most important thing for me is the thing that's becoming increasingly difficult in today's world, and that's to surround myself by people who are different than me. And I've been an interdisciplinary researcher for a long time, but my family is very diverse in a way that I love, but other people think must be very difficult. My mom came from a very Christian Midwestern farming family. My dad came from a Jewish, wealthy, before the Depression family from New York. And I mean, they're just like polar opposites in many ways, but such loving people at the same time. And I mean, violently disagree about things, and that's something that I have deeply internalized, from day one growing up, but that I feel like I seek out intellectually, and it's not easy to do. Even just on a career level, it is hard to be an interdisciplinary researcher. I mean, it's hard to get funding. It's hard to even be allowed into departments. You're supposed to stay in one lane. And even just at that level, it's difficult. So then to also bring that into a more social level where you're trying to get feedback about, all the things you're thinking about, both in your work, but in your day-to-day life, it's not easy. But to me, that's the most useful thing. I try to listen to as many perspectives as I can. I try to really talk and understand people from different backgrounds as much as I can. And that's what grounds me every time you have a conversation with someone different than you, it reminds you, this is a wonderful human who is seeing the world in a completely different way. And there must be something right in what they're thinking about. So let me reevaluate. Let me integrate this into kind of, how I think about things. So that's kind of on a personal level. I'll say on another level, this sounds a little futuristic sometimes, and sometimes I told you I go through cycles with our own research. Sometimes I think it's too futuristic, and I'm like, this is never going to work. But then I'm going through a phase again where actually I am seeing the potential. This is where AI might actually be helpful. So something we're working on is this is going to be oversimplified, but I think the name will get the idea across. And I kind of alluded to it already. What if you can make a moral GPS for yourself? So what if you can train an AI to understand what you actually think and want, and then it could give you feedback when you make judgments and be like, you said you wanted this. This is what you're saying you want now. Do you want to reevaluate? Because it seems like, maybe race is impacting you more than you think right now. Or, you've made a couple of judgments now. You told us your model was this. You told us you didn't want race to matter, or you didn't want class to matter, or gender to matter. But it certainly seems like it based on your choices, so do you want to think about that and hear ways to do that? And we're testing this out on ourselves first. And I'll tell you, it's working for me. And not perfectly by any means, but it's working for me. And I think that this is a place AI might be able to help.
It's amazing that you said that. I think you're exactly right, where you have, in some ways, it's a conversation, but you're asking it to provide guardrails for how you see the world and to give you insights. It's interesting because as I was developing Happy AI, and for your listeners, that's HAPPI.ai. As I was developing that, there was an individual I spoke to, and he's the CTO at Shutterfly, and we were talking about things. And it's an interesting conversation because I had never met the fellow. He said, you're my advisor. And I said, what are you talking about? And he says, well, I have 10 advisors. And what I've done is, he's a computer scientist guy. He said, what I've done is I've collected every statement you've made, every video, everything that's been written, everything you've talked about, and created a Jim Doty AI.
Oh, interesting.
And he calls it Doty Magic AI. And it's actually quite hilarious. And people have asked me to use it. And so it's like you're talking to me, but it's interesting because you ask the type of questions you're asking, and it says something like, well, you have to consider others. What the statement you made is really about what you want, but there's a larger world, and you need to think about how your behavior impacts others, and you may want to consider blah, 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 blah. And it's funny because my wife periodically asks it questions, and sometimes she gets tearful because she says, oh, yes, that was so impactful. And it's a very strange thing. One, because it's pretending it's me, but two, but the power of being able to ask and have someone who you feel is a honest broker to interact with you without a biased agenda, but who's focused on sort of a larger picture of how the world works.
Yeah, curiously, how accurate do you think that is? Like when you play with this thing, does it give the answers you would give most of the time?
Yes, and it really pisses me off because I don't need to live, I guess, because it answers all the goddamn questions. And in fact, it's more articulate than I.
That's the hardest thing about these darn LLMs, right? They don't say they don't get confused. Well, they could definitely get confused, but yeah.
Well, yeah, they yes. Well, it's funny you say that because I asked one to do a bio. And it did a very wonderful bio, but it said Dr. Doty has received these awards, and it listed like 10. Well, 5 of them were just made up.
Yeah.
But I still put them in my CV.
That's awesome. I love that. But you bring up a really important point, Jim. There are a couple of points, and that is that to some degree, just having something to interact with to make you reflect, even if that thing isn't giving you accurate information, it actually gets us a lot of the way because we do have a lot of agency, and just giving ourselves the space to reflect and to consider other viewpoints in itself goes a long way. So that's one thing I've really, come to appreciate is just having anything that will give you some type of feedback to make you rethink things can be valuable. So that's one. The second is, now that said, there's a danger. And that danger is if we rely on that too much, we may not realize how the feedback is kind of pushing us in one direction, and that's another thing that we think about a lot and that we really have to pay attention to. And we're kind of testing how often that's true. And that could be in kind of a completely unintentional way, even just the way you build the model. Like if the AI has this model, this mathematical model about you behind the scenes, and asks you questions assuming that model, maybe it means you end up kind of adopting that model, even though you didn't have that model to start with. It's kind of a framing effect of sorts. You can kind of think of it that way. And we're testing now to see whether that happens or if that happens for some people more than others. That's kind of like an unintentional version, but there could also be a very intentional version, of course. And so, what would be worse? That's kind of the nightmare that we have to worry about is what if we have these AIs that are making us into different moral decision makers, buying us in this, making us go in a certain direction, and making us really confident we're right. That's
well, yeah, but that's again, this is not the first time brainwashing has occurred, and it continues, right? And whether it's in its most primitive form, we get like the Stockholm effect from being isolated and then identifying with your captors, or other ways where you don't realize, but just by sort of background things that are going on, it alters who you are. And I think, again, you talk about humility, and I certainly concur that in regard to science and our findings, we have to be very humble and recognize, one, that we don't know everything, and be open to possibilities. But I think it is very disconcerting in some ways how, and I'm not talking about other people, I'm talking about myself, how you can potentially be manipulated. It would be interesting if you had this reflecting AI. Every time it puts out a response, there's a second AI that analyzes that to be sure that that one's not prejudiced.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of an ethical education, right? If you get trained in ethics, that's kind of what you do, is you're constantly listening to people arguing. And so AI's arguing might be sufficient to, to get you there, especially because some of these days AIs can spit out very reasonable ethical arguments and also go off the rails. But,
Well, exactly. But the problem is if you don't have the insight or awareness that they can go off the rails, again, there's a tendency to rely on technologies excessively, thinking that they don't make a mistake. And certainly there are many that are designed that rarely, if ever, make a mistake. AI certainly is not there yet, but that is a possibility I think we all have to be concerned about.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you a theory. I mean, part of this is you're trying to incorporate, as I understand it, sort of game theory, and there's always the example of the driverless car and the different options, and that's always intrigued me, because how do you first of all, I mean, accidents happen in microseconds, and decisions have to be immediately made. And I was having a conversation with somebody. So let's say, you're in a car with your family. Let's say there's 4 of you, and then there is a school bus filled with young children who futuristically, one may be the next Einstein or whatever. And there's an accident scenario, and either the car you're in has to sacrifice itself so that the people in the bus may live, or you kill your own family. And, how do you deal with that moral and ethical dilemma?
Yeah, so I'm going to take the easy way out first, which is how do you make a car that can deal with that dilemma rather than how I would deal with that? That's why this is, it's still not an easy question to answer. It's easier.
And that's what I'm actually asking. I mean, it's as a human being, it's hard to sacrifice your entire family and yourself for quote unquote a greater purpose.
Yeah, and it's also it's a really hard, and that's why it's a moral dilemma. And these types of moral dilemmas is what got me into this whole space back when I started a long time ago. In neuroscience, I should say. That was before we thought AI can do anything useful. So the approach that they tried first, I think it was Mercedes that first took a stance in this. And the approach was, look, we're going to tell you what our policy is, and then you buy the car that has the policy you like. And I think Mercedes was, if I might be getting this wrong, but I think that they were the ones that said, we're going to prioritize the people in the car. And actually it's interesting because people have they want to signal one thing. So people didn't like that on the one hand, because they didn't want to be the type of person who would put themselves in front of others. But on the other hand, they wanted to actually buy the car that did that. And so at some point, I think, I might be getting this all wrong, the story wrong, but at some point they were like, we're just not going to, that won't work anymore because we're putting people in ethical bind, and now they don't want to buy the cars at all then. And I think but that's one approach. One approach is that you say, here's our policy. And that's, you buy the car that works. Now, another approach is that you train the AI in the car for yourself, for the driver. Then nobody has to know what your policy is. It's just you have like different scenarios. Part of the way this was studied was by a group at MIT who they developed a website called The Moral Machine, where they kind of made a bunch of these different dilemmas. Like, would you go turn right or left if there was a dog you were going to kill on the right and 2 kids you were going to kill on the left? What if, and lots of different iterations of this. And we have a version of this we do with kidney exchanges, so a different setting. But imagine that you answer 100 of those for your car. Now they have a good model of what you think is important. Nobody needs to know, so there's no signaling. And, you have it personalized for your car. Now, that's one approach, and I think one approach people can take. Another approach is to have a voting system where you kind of have different policies, and then you allow community members in certain ways and maybe you weight certain experts more heavily than others or not. You can it's kind of like a government system. There's never a perfect governance system, but you vote on them, and so that's the best one you can come up with at the time. So maybe you have something like that, and so it's the policy that's been voted on, perhaps weighted by experts or not, depending on kind of how you want to handle it. I think those are the types of things that we're imagining and kind of exploring. And I told you we have a version of this we're doing with kidney exchanges, and thinking with that, what would kind of the context here is that well, you would know this better than me, Jim, about but there are at least two main ways you can get kidneys. One is a deceased. Should you tell the story for me instead, actually?
No. Well, I think what you're saying is one can be a person who's been declared brain dead, and their family elects to donate their organs. Of course, I think, and the point you're getting at, though, is that many people don't match. So now we have live donors in certain situations with kidneys. And then there's probably, although it's certainly been immortalized in movies, where there are countries which harvest the organs of prisoners and then sell them to the highest bidder. So I think those are the major scenarios.
But some are even more good spirit in that, which is that we unfortunately have the situation.
The friend or somebody who donates to somebody anonymously, yeah.
That, or just, there are more kidneys needed than we have available to transplant. So when one becomes available, who do you give it to? Right? And right now, there are different policies on this, as I understand it. At different parts of the country, different hospitals, different countries all have different ways to handle it. And most policies only take a certain limited things into account, most of which are medical factors, some of which are very practical factors, like how far away is the person. But in the past, when people were trying to decide how kidneys should be allocated, or specifically how dialysis should be allocated when there wasn't enough around, there was actually something called the God Committee, where it was I think it was 13 community members and kind of random community members. There was a priest, there was like a mechanic, there was a whole bunch of different people, and they decided who should get dialysis. And they took into consideration all different other types of factors, like, do they give back to the community? Are they a good person? Have they gone to jail before? And when we do our research, when we research kind of the general population, most people think that there are moral factors that should be taken into consideration when you decide who gets a kidney that are currently in the algorithms. Things like, how many dependents do you have? Some people think, whether you caused your kidney disease by saying being an alcoholic or something should matter. Now, people will have different opinions about this. And
especially if you're the alcoholic who needs that.
That's right. And age. And so age is another thing people think should matter. Sure. And, and they think it should matter for reasons that aren't just medical. So people will have different opinions. So the question is, if you want to incorporate some of this into a kidney exchange system, some of which use AI already to try to allocate kidneys, how would you do it? And the way we learn kind of people's moral preferences or opinions, if you will, is very similar to the moral machine that the MIT people are doing. We give people different scenarios. Like, here's patient A. Here are a bunch of features about them, and here are their values. Like, here's how many kids they have, dependents they have. Here's how many drinks per day, they've drank, their age, how long they've been on the waiting list, these kinds of things. Here's patient B. Here are their features. Which one do you think should get the kidney if only one becomes available and they're equally compatible? And through that, we can kind of learn a moral model about what you think. And this is kind of a isolated scenario where we can test out how you would teach AI moral concepts and how it would pan out. And so we also have to think about then, you can make, and let's say that worked perfectly and we could learn your moral preferences and tweak them and you would trust it. We would need to make one version perhaps for a surgeon, a different version for the board of that hospital, and perhaps a different version, for whatever the group is. Usually it's not just one hospital, it's multiple hospitals that are kind of part of a network or something. So how do you aggregate the different opinions in these different situations? That's, we've been trying to implement some of the kind of strategies I was telling you about before.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure you've heard the story of Steve Jobs' liver transplant, right? Where he obviously lived in Northern California, and suddenly he comes to the top of the list in Memphis, Tennessee, and again, I don't know the circumstances or the facts. I'm sure that there was some reason he happened to show up in Memphis and get his transplant, but I would assume that there may be some bias because of his wealth and status, which allowed him to take advantage of a system. And again, this is always, I think, the challenge is there is a subset of people who have decided their life is more important than other people's lives. And this is actually, maybe you can comment on this from your moral ethical perspective. People keep talking about the singularity and uploading themselves, right? And so there are all these statements. And in fact, it also relates to all the work on longevity, where you have many people in the billionaire class who are dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into longevity research. And also what I was mentioning earlier, and these are very elitist things because they only benefit a very select small number of people. And while I acknowledge that many of people in the billionaire class are incredibly intelligent and moral and ethical, there's a subset who, frankly, are not in any way moral or ethical, and they're willing to manipulate the system, and how do you deal with that in our society? I'm not trying to put you just on the spot. I'm just
sort of
proposing or making comments that I think about, and I just wanted your thoughts on that.
It's funny. My dad was a physicist turned MD, but I think he probably wanted to be a philosopher maybe at some point. And so I did philosophy and neuroscience in undergrad. And when he met my philosophy advisor for the first time, it was like, and admittedly he had dementia and it kind of had set in already, but it was like, before he even said hello, he just asked all the philosophical questions he ever want answered, to this, my poor philosophy advisor. And he was like, whoa, I can't solve the world for you. So I feel kind of like, Jim, you're like, I'm not an ethical expert by any means. I'm just a mere human who's doing her best and often does not do anything close to that. So I can't solve all these problems, but I can tell you one thing I do think about, and I meant to say this in a couple of your other questions before, but I think one thing that would help all of us, both for ourselves, but also for helping others and changing the societal culture is to remember that we all need to learn morally, and we will all make moral mistakes. And I think many people have heard of a fixed versus growth mindset kind of in general. And the idea here is that if you think that intelligence is something that's fixed, then you're born with it and you either have it or you don't, then there's no room for you to grow. And there's no room for you to learn and improve. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, which is that you can teach yourself things, then you have room to grow and it empowers you and you achieve much more. Many people haven't heard that there's also a moral growth mindset and a moral fixed mindset. And I think society has really kind of just dug into this fixed moral mindset that's kind of this cancel culture. Like, you do one thing wrong, that means you're a terrible person who could never, ever, ever, be redeemed or do a good thing in the future. And it's also an indication of who you are as a person. And the problem is our morality really matters to us. No one likes being called a terrible person. And so our defense mechanisms are so intense when we have that kind of attack. We are not going to learn when we're doing that. We're in fight or flight mode when someone tells us we're a terrible person, and we will dig in our heels and come up with every rationale possible to justify what we just did, even if it was bad. But if we can have a safe environment where we're allowed to introspect and there'll be less judgment, then we can often be like, that really sucked what I did, and how do I improve that? And so the reason I say this is I think that if we can encourage that kind of culture overall, then I think anyone can change. Not anyone, most people. I have studied psychopaths, for example, but we'll put them aside. It's a very small group in the population. I think anyone can change, and I think anyone can want to change. Not everyone will, but especially if you see other people changing and caring, and you see that you're not going to get your head bitten off every time you make a mistake, then you're going to be much more likely to want to do that, because it feels, as and as you cite all the time, when you do good things for people, it makes you feel good too. So it's, if we can make it more safe for people to learn and to make mistakes and not be called terrible, then I think we all have a lot more potential.
No, I think that's really, really important for people. I'm sure you're familiar with. Here you have the Dalai Lama, who epitomizes compassion, and then there's this incident with this child and the tongue thing where he shared a candy or something or other. And here he's immediately demonized. His whole life is rejected from one incident, which was propagandized by the Chinese on some level. And then the other, though, aspect is you have a person who, by every level of judgment by society, is a horrible, horrible human being. And then the person does one act to help somebody. And then it's like, oh, my God, they're the best person. Look at what this person did, this one act of kindness that saved this life. And everything is written off. And so it's like this weird paradox of how people respond at one time. But I think your statement about this ethical, moral growth mindset is really critically important. And I would just like to also say that, oftentimes we're talking about agency, that many people get the impression that how they see the world or how they act has no impact. And it's not true at all. And I think each and every one of us have the ability every day to improve the life of at least one person. And I think that's where you're coming from. And I think that's an important thing to remember. In closing, since we could chat forever, I think.
Absolutely.
What is it that you're working on now that excites you? And I know you've written the book, but is there a particular thing, or maybe is there a paper coming out, or is there just something in Jana's life that's interesting, that is probably as interesting as anything else we've talked about?
Oh, man. I think there are two things that I'm most excited about now. No, three things. You probably only want me to say one thing. And these are
no, you can say 10 if you want.
Oh, wow. Well, that would be good then. So the first one is this kind of moral education component, but AI based. So I really am, and again, this surprised me. I'm usually the skeptic in our research group, and I've often thought about, as a tangent, why is it that the computer scientists and the philosophers are different than me? And I think it's, I chose my discipline because I love this thing inside, this noggin of mine. Like, the human brain is just the most beautiful thing to me. And so I think I'm almost biased towards it. So I tend to be more pessimistic than my colleagues sometimes in some of our moral AI work. But I really have taken a turn where I think AI can really help us become better moral decision makers if we do it right. And so I'm excited by that prospect, even if it's just to help me personally, because help me do a little better. But I think it has the potential to help many people if we get it right, do better. So that's one thing. Kind of this moral GPS idea, that's, and how that would be implemented. The second thing is the social connection idea. So we didn't get to talk too much about this time, but I'm really delving into trying to understand what that is. And the way we're trying to get at it is trying to understand what is social synchrony. We know that when we feel connected, our emotions, our facial expressions, our emotions, our physiology, eventually our brains, those all become synchronized over time in some way. And what does synchrony mean? What does that coordination look like? That's still a big open question, but somehow that does amazing things to our body and to our mind, and it makes us more resilient. So I'm working with a mathematician to try to develop some mathematical and computational ways to understand that, because there's a lot of technical complications there, but we've also been developing a online platform to study kind of social interactions at scale, and hopefully there'll be a paper out on that soon. That, by the way, was one actual good thing about the pandemic for my research. I've been trying to develop that for like 3 years before the pandemic, but believe it or not, there was a time before Zoom, and it was not easy to figure out how to build something like Zoom into your own platform. And I was in fact talking to Zoom before the pandemic happened, and they were like, they were just this little company and they didn't know how to do it. But pandemic happened, and all of a sudden video technology worked.
Yes.
So now we have a platform that's been up and running. But really understanding how is it that when we interact, even like this, when you're in California and I'm here in North Carolina, what does that do to our brains and our physiology? How does that lead to resilience and all the downstream effects? So that's another thing I'm excited about and really care about and think we need to get a handle on. And I hope that can also lead to some research on, how can we combat loneliness? Also, how can we overcome some of the social division that we have in society, and how can we, forge more social connection? And then the last thing, I wouldn't say I'm excited about, but it's not that I'm not excited about it. I just really feel I have a moral compulsion for it, and it's not sexy. And it's this kind of this translational work that needs to happen with moral AI work. When you're in academia, you are only rewarded for proofs of concept. So we write these papers, and it's in this little isolated context. You publish the paper, and then you move on. But that needs, in order to actually impact the world, which is supposed to be our goal here. I mean, the reason we're doing this is to try to make AI that actually, has a good impact in the world. There's this huge gap between what you create and what needs to be in developers' hands to actually make AI systems that work. Same thing on the policy level. Like, how do you go from whatever those policy words are to what's going to be in developers' hands? So I'm really committed now to trying to figure out how to do this translational work and try to raise some money for it. And academia does not like this stuff, so it's not sexy, but I feel it's a moral compulsion. So I hope we can get more people in this space too.
No, that's exciting, and you're right. It's interesting, how academia decides what's sexy or not. And what's fascinating is you look at social science or psychology research, and people have made their careers on stuff that's not reproducible whatsoever, which is a whole another indictment about academia or this sense of self-import when the way it's structured, unfortunately, it allows for a lot of people to manipulate the system and lie. That could be a whole moral AI piece in and of itself. I don't think academia would like that either.
I was going to say I should probably start keeping my mouth shut, although I'm not very good at that. So,
No, nor am I. I'm sure you're familiar with Martha Nussbaum.
Of course, yeah.
So I think I was looking as we were before we talked, and she has a great quote, which I think sort of puts all of this together. It says, "What is most important is a conception of the human being as a dignified, free being who shapes his or her own life in cooperation with others and who is capable of deliberation about the common good." I think that's... that
was a perfect quote to end on. You're right.
Yes. So, listen, what a joy. We'll have you back a second time. We can go into the next part of our discussion. And again, congratulations on the great work you're doing. And it's really wonderful to see you again. And I hope we have an opportunity to connect in person.
I do too. Thank you so much, Jim. It really has been such a pleasure. And congratulations to you too, both on your book and on Happy AI. And I look forward to cheering you on from the sidelines.
Again, thank you for being with us today. The Into the Magic Shop podcast can be found where you find your most popular podcasts, or you can find us at intothemagicshop.com.